As we did last week, we're going to start this morning by kind of reviewing a little bit about what we covered, but when I say we, I mean we, all of us. I asked you last week to think about what are just, one thought that kind of stuck in your mind from previous classes, and so I'm going to do that again today. Last week, Adam talked about the fragmentary nature of the Old Testament. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that's first been dumped out of the box. All the pieces are there. Some of them are hidden, flipped over, and they have to be uncovered to be able to see. They all have to be put into the right, into the right place to connect together, and that's what the Old Testament does. Pat talked about the confidence that we have in Jesus Christ, and that is very much a primary part of the book of Hebrews. We'll actually build on that idea of confidence as we get all the way into chapter 10. And that's really one of the big conclusions that the writer of Hebrews is going to make, is this confidence that we have to draw near to God. And that is such an awesome part that we need to recognize, not just when we're praying, but to recognize that every day through Jesus Christ, I draw near to the God who created this world and everything that is in it. And the only way that I can have that confidence is through Jesus Christ. Ben put me on the spot. What's my take on this? And I talked about the fact that I see this contrast of that which is better. Jesus is that which is better. All right, so from our discussion last week, let me get a volunteer. What stuck in your mind about what we talked about last week? Again, it could be just one word, an idea, a thought. It's only been 1 week this time, so it's not going to be as hard to remember. I like the idea. Missy's got notes that she's looking at. Anybody, what sticks in your mind? It doesn't necessarily have to be what we talked about last week, but just what we've covered so far in the book of Hebrews. What's one thought that is kind of stuck in your mind from our discussions? Perfected. Absolutely. I love that word because it has so many different meanings. I think probably the book of Hebrews gives us a deeper understanding of that word. Perfected, made perfect, is perfect, than any other book of the Bible. I was actually just talking to Mark about that before class a little while ago. And he pointed out the idea that it really is completion. It's that which is not yet completed being made complete. And we will see that again as we go in even through chapter 5, talking about how Jesus is made perfect so that we can be made perfect. All right, anything sticks in your mind that we talked about last week or in previous classes? Had to have been at least one other idea. Go ahead. Yes, please. Subject. Subject or subjective. Oh, good one. And very much this idea, it's introduced back in chapter 1, that the idea that the world is not subject to angels, but it has been subjected to the Son of Man, and even as we talked about, man himself. I mentioned in Genesis 1 the idea of the image of God. It's a theme that Logan had talked about in his series of lessons on the book of Ephesians. The idea of being made in the image of God. And in Genesis 1, the emphasis, the immediate context of the idea of being in the image of God means to rule over the creation of God. Now, ruling in the way that God rules, in a way that is good for that which has been created, in the same way God rules over us, but in a way that benefits us, not uses or abuses us. And in the same way, man is to rule over the world. But ultimately, as we got into chapter 2, we saw the writer saying, all things are to be subjected to the Son, but remember what it says? We do not yet see that. Which emphasizes two things. One, Jesus, at the time of the writing, was not the master of the rule over all things, at least in the sense they had not all been subjected to him. And number two, that it was something that would come. It was going to happen. All right, anybody else with any thoughts or comments about what we talked about? All right, keep these thoughts in mind, what we covered today, and see if there's anything that you just go, wow, that's a eureka moment for me. And we be ready to talk about that next week. All right, so our theme is God speaks to us in his Son. Times past, of course, he spoke to us in various ways through the prophets and the fathers, but now he speaks to us in his Son. This is where we kind of left off with last week. We're going to start in chapter 2, verse 9, and just kind of quickly review what we talked about at the end of our last class. We talked about the fact that the one who does the sanctifying, and who of course is Jesus, and the one who is sanctified, which is me and you, are from one. And I want to go back and kind of spend a little bit more time on this. If you're reading from the New American Standard, which is what I normally use, it actually says from one Father. But if you'll notice, the word Father is in italics, and that's because the translators admit that that word is not in the original language. They believe it's implied, and so that's why they added that word, but it's not in the original language. Literal just says they are from one. And it's kind of a question of translators as to what is meant by one. It could be one God or one Father. It could be talking about one particular individual, Adam, or more likely, Abraham. If you look in verse 16 of chapter 2, it'll mention the idea of the children of Abraham. And so that certainly is a possibility here. It could not be a person or being, but maybe for one purpose, one intent, one goal. All of those are possible there, but the emphasis of the writer is the fact that they have a united origin. So if they have a united origin, then what the writer is getting at is that essentially they're going to be walking in lockstep. Their destiny is going to be the same. So whatever was true about the Son should also be true about those who are sanctified by the Son. Now, what was true about the Son in this particular context? What was the writer of Hebrews emphasizing about Jesus in this context? Psalm 22 should be a clue for us. It's his suffering. Psalm 22 is, for lack of a better term, the crucifixion psalm. It is what Jesus quoted when he was on the cross. We see examples of it being fulfilled by the Jews as they wag their heads to him or about him there on the cross. This context is talking about his suffering. So he sanctifies, he is made perfect through suffering. So what does that say about those who are being sanctified by him? Adam touched on this a good bit Wednesday. What's going to be, what should be the expectation of those who are to be sanctified by Jesus? Exactly. They're going to suffer. And in fact, they're going to be made complete, perfected through sufferings, just as Jesus was perfected through suffering. Paul talks about this in his letter to Timothy. He says, all those who desire to be faithful in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. And notice what the writer of Hebrews says. It is fitting. And I made a point, it's not the writer just saying, yeah, it's right, yeah, Jesus should suffer. No, what he's saying is, this was God's design. This was God's plan. It was his plan that his son would be perfected, completed through suffering. And so therefore, it is designed that we will be completed through suffering. Now, it's really outside the scope of our class to talk about that theological discussion of, well, why did God choose that way? We'll see it further as we get through the book of Hebrews. I don't want to get too tied up in that right now, but I want us to recognize that here's what the writer is trying to get them to understand. They will be suffering. This book is very, very clear. This is something that they were going to be suffering, even more than what they were facing at the time this letter was written. And so he's trying to get them to understand that this is fitting, this is appropriate, this is part of God's plan. This is what your sanctifier went through, and this is what you will go through. And yet, as Pat pointed out last week, we can have confidence in that. And we will see more and more why we have that confidence. Yes, please.
I just want to say something.
Mm-hmm.
This didn't start with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
This has been God's plan since the day he put Adam and Eve on the garden.
That's right.
One of the things he was speaking to them before he put them. So you'll find this not only starting with Christ, you'll find it throughout the Old Testament with his people. And Christ himself had to do it. And Christ's people now had to do it.
Exactly. Brett's pointed out that this was not something that begins with Jesus as the Christ. It begins in the garden. When you look at the result of man's sin, and you look at what God said to both the man and the woman, what do you find? You find suffering. You find the increased suffering in giving birth to a child. Here is the, what do we call it, the most glorious miracle that happens, the life coming from nothing. God has created life, yet what does it cause for the woman? It causes great pain. What about for the man whose job is to tend and create food for a living? What does it say? By the sweat of your brow, it will be much harder now for him to produce food. So you see this idea of suffering. Even what was said to the, to the woman, but it was the seed of the woman. What was going to happen? His heel would be crushed. There would be pain. Now, he was going to crush the head of Satan, the serpent, but his heel would be crushed in doing so. So yes, this is something that's been part of God's plan all along. And I think Brett's point does help us to kind of touch on this idea of why suffering? Sin. There's the easy answer. It's because of sin. God knew that there would be sin, so God's plan was that the answer to sin had to recognize what sin really was. Let me go to Isaiah chapter 8. I do want us to take a look at the context. We find two quotations here in Hebrews 2 that are taken from Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. Even though they're consecutive verses in Isaiah, scholars tell us there are two separate sentences, and they have two separate ideas that are obviously related to one another. But the context actually goes back to verse 12 of Isaiah chapter 8. God, through Isaiah, is speaking to the rebellious people of Israel who have turned away from him again and again and again. And so through Isaiah, God is saying to these people, you are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people say is a conspiracy. You are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. So God here is encouraging Isaiah, and we're going to see his sons also, that they were not to be concerned about, and when we say fear here, it wasn't the idea of just walking out in terror. It's the idea of fearing the Lord or fearing the powers of this world. Who are you going to subject yourselves to? Who do you think is your boss? And so he's telling Isaiah and his sons, you're not to fear what they fear. You're not to be concerned about what they think is most important. Now drop down to verse 16, Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. God here is making a point. Do not fear the things of the world, but instead let my law be your seal. Let my law be your guide. So then we have verse 17, which is what the writer of Hebrews quotes. And I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will look eagerly for him. That's what's quoted there in Hebrews 2. Wait for the Lord, or look for the Lord. Put your confidence and your trust in the Lord. And then in verse 18, behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for the signs and the wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on the Mount Zion. So here, Isaiah is saying, the children the Lord has given me is a sign and wonder for Israel. The Hebrew writer takes that to really expand it out to all of God's people. That they are, in fact, a sign and a wonder to those who are not. That's an interesting thought. It's found in the book of Romans. It's found in a number of different places. The idea that God uses those who are his disciples to bring those who are not. Jealousy is a term that's used a number of times in the book of Romans to talk about how God used the Jews to bring the Gentiles and then used the Gentiles to bring the rebellious Jews, all back into harmony with him. And so the writer of, in Isaiah chapter 8, we find that same thing. But then I want you to notice, drop all the way down to verse 19. When they say to you, when Israel says to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter. You know, how silly it was of them to do that. They were looking to all of the spiritual things of the world around them to try to understand their destiny, understand what's their direction. God says, should not a people consult their God? Doesn't it make sense? The one who created you, shouldn't you be asking him instead of the spiritists of the world? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? Remember Saul near the end of his reign where he went to that spirit woman to reach out? What does Samuel say? Samuel's dead. Why aren't you asking God? God is alive. That's what the writer of Isaiah said. Notice what he says here in verse 20. To the law and to the testimony. Now put that in context of what we're talking about in Hebrews. Here are Christians who are being persecuted, and they're going to face greater persecution. And they have a living Savior. The empty tomb confirms that they have a living Savior. And yet what are they doing? They're going back to old things that have been fulfilled and completed and done away with. That's what God's trying to get them to understand. I've given you something better. I've given you something that is alive, that lives in every one of you. Why do you want to go back to that which is gone, that which is dead? So finally we find here, going back to Hebrews chapter 2, what does it say in verse 14? Since the children share in flesh and blood, what did the Son have to do? What did the Messiah have to do? He had to do the same thing. He had to become one of us. He had to share in flesh and blood. And that doesn't just simply mean that he became physically like us. It meant he had to be like us in every way. In this context, he had to be tempted. He had to suffer. He had to become like us so that he could be the one who completes us, who perfects us, who takes us from what we had become because of sin back to what God wants us to be when he first created us. Very good. So Jesus had to become like us so that he could be a help to us. And then ultimately, verse 14, the middle part, what did he also partake of? Not just flesh and blood. Death. He had to partake death. And everything that is involved in this idea of death, Jesus had to face that, had to go through that. Look in Luke chapter 11, if you would. Somebody read verses 21 and 22. It's a parable of Jesus. And it's one that, in its context, it really, it's a great lesson. Obviously, Jesus taught it. But I think it finds its greatest understanding in what we're talking about right here. Luke chapter 11, verses 21 and 22. When somebody gets there, please read it, please, when you get there. Go ahead, Cole.
When a strong man fully armed guards his own palace, his goods are safe. But when one stronger than he attacks him and overcomes him, he takes away his armor, which he trusted, and divides his spoil.
All right, is Satan powerful? Please, everybody say yes. What's his greatest weapon? What's his greatest power? Deceit is powerful, but there's one I think that's even more powerful. What's the power of sin? Guilt is an effect of it, but what's ultimately the great power of sin? Death. That's what sin does. Romans 6, the wages of sin, the reward of sin is death. In light of this parable that Colt just read, what does Jesus do? We see it in all those movies of James Bond or characters like that. Yeah. Jesus takes death out of the hand of Satan and overcomes it. That's what Jesus has done. He's taken his most powerful weapon and he has overcome it.
Can we dig into that a little bit?
Sure, please.
I mean, we know Jesus was not the first who was resurrected. So what is Jesus, this is kind of an informal question.
Mm-hmm.
You dig into it, by overcoming death, by overcoming sin, what was he actually done to defeat Satan? I think when I read the scriptures, the thing that stands out to me is you go all the way back to the book of Job, you find there are a few different places in scripture you find that Satan is there accusing mankind. And he said he's there accusing us day and night.
Mm-hmm.
Or he was.
Mm-hmm.
Of what? That we're not worthy of God's blessing.
Mm-hmm.
We're sinful. We're not worthy. It's what he said about Job. He put a hedge around him.
Right,
Let me show you what happened.
exactly. So Brett's question is a very good one.
One more point.
Oh, go ahead.
Jesus proved all that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That it is not beyond a man to serve God. You're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Shut up.
It's a good way of saying it. Brett posed the question. I think he answered the question also. What is it about Jesus dying and overcoming death that does something to take away our sin? And Brett's point was going back to the story of Job, how that Satan was accusing Job in the presence of God. you're protecting him. He won't make that choice if you take this away. And God just says to Satan over and over again, you're wrong. You're wrong. And I'll prove it. And he does. And ultimately, Jesus is that ultimate proof. Satan is saying, look at what I've done to mankind. They're all sinners. They're all worthless. They're all terrible. And God says, no, I created them. And my son is going to take the punishment that they deserve for their sin and make them holy in my sight. And Brett's last comment is God saying to Satan, so shut up. And that's ultimately, I think, what we see here with Jesus overcoming death. He's overcome Satan's argument against you and me. Anybody else with thoughts or comments to add to that? I appreciate that very much, Brett. That is a very vital point. I will mention one thing in light of what Brett talked about. I had this on my notes to talk about. What's the one thing that is not mentioned in this context in Hebrews, nor anywhere in the book of Hebrews? And we think it is such a vital part of our salvation. I'll get to you in just a minute, Mike. There's one thing that is not mentioned in this context. It's implied, but it's not mentioned. The resurrection. There is not one word about the resurrection in the book of Hebrews. The death is most certainly here, the sacrifice. It's implied in the sense that it says he overcame death. But the resurrection is never mentioned in the book of Hebrews. I don't know I have something insightful or powerful to say about that. It's more just interesting to me. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was just going to point out that, when we talk about, I'm not quite sure how this ties in. It's just a thought. When we talk about Jesus conquering death in addition to sin, I think a lot of times we think, well, you conquered sin, therefore death is because sin is what causes death. All you got to do is defeat sin. But once sin entered the world, even those who do not sin still die.
Right.
Children still die. Babies die. Babies die in the womb. What do? Sin has entered the world, and those who are forgiven of their sins still die. Mm-hmm. So fixing the problem of sin did not, in and of itself, take death out of the world. There's still death. So I think death has to be conquered also, and you get to the resurrection. I mean, the resurrection is where that happens. And the real big difference between when you talk about, Jesus is not the first person ever resurrected, but he's the first resurrected never to die again.
Right. Exactly. The first one resurrected to eternal life. And that ultimately, of course, is not just the book of Hebrews. We saw it in Ephesians when Logan was talking about the book of Ephesians. That's ultimately what the message of God is I'm giving you something better than even what Satan has taken away. Anybody else with thoughts or comments? Down through about verse 15. 16, actually. All right, let me look at the last two verses of chapter 2. And as I mentioned before, there are so many transitions that we find in the book of Hebrews. And this is another one of those great examples of where the writer has established a point and then builds something else on top of that. And it has our key word, therefore. Verse 17 begins with this word, therefore. Therefore, he had to be made like his brethren in all things. That's the point he just established. Had to become flesh and blood, had to be subject to temptation, had to die. He had to become like his brethren in all things that he might become. And again, this is that. It took me several years before I fully grasped this idea that Jesus did not come to this world fully formed. And I'm not talking about physically. I'm talking about to be our Savior. There were things he had to go through to become our, in this case, merciful and faithful high priest. First of all, what is a merciful high priest? What's being emphasized there? Forgiveness. Yeah. Forgiving that which does not deserve to be forgiven. And of course, we see that embodied in the words of Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. But it's much more than just simply that one statement. His entire life is very much that idea of the mercy of God. The mercy that is shown through the high priest. But then I want to also talk about this idea, a faithful high priest. Normally when we talk about faithful, I'm afraid sometimes we really have completely the wrong idea. Faithful means I'm right on all the issues. That is not what it means. But even the idea of faithful itself, we generally, looking at it biblically, we think about being faithful to God means that I trust in God. But faithful also has a kind of an other side to it. Because God is described as being faithful. Obviously, God can't be faithful to himself. He is self-existent, so he knows he is. What does it mean that God is faithful or that Jesus is a faithful high priest? Unwavering. That's a good part. That's really the foundation. Trustworthy. It's the idea that, go ahead, Ben.
Well, I just always thought about it too, I have a relationship with God and he has a relationship with me. And if I transpose that onto a relationship with my wife, when I say I'm faithful to my wife, it's not that I believe in her.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's only unwavering, it's all of those things within some. It's that there's a fidelity there, that there's never going to be adultery, there's never going to be this searching for something else. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is the relationship, this is the bond that I have. So like even in the English language, we use it all the time
Exactly.
to represent something much greater than just our hope or belief in someone.
Exactly. And when we look at Ephesians chapter 5, what does God say about marriage through Paul? This is just to illustrate the relationship I want to have with you. So you're absolutely right. That is exactly what this idea of faithful means here. So as it applies to Jesus as a faithful high priest, goes back to what Pat talked about last week. We have confidence. We have absolute confidence that we have a high priest that we can go through, and he is going to be serving as a high priest should serve. People of Israel didn't always have that. They had a high priest that was scoundrels. If you remember, during the time of Eli's sons, they weren't trustworthy. Go ahead, Brett.
You already said it. The reference to Ephesians is perfectly exactly right. It's a perfect reference.
Mm-hmm.
It takes you straight back to Genesis 3:16. The desire of you for your husband, you will rule. That's what Paul was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
All the way back to the beginning.
So then we see really this is a fitting description of Jesus as a merciful and faithful high priest. He has been made complete to do this role. And that's why the Hebrew writer is going back to our bigger picture. He's telling us Jesus is better. The chosen one of God is better. Right now he's comparing better to the angels, and now he's really in the stage where he's talking about better than Moses. And that's a good transition for us to go on into chapter 3. So another therefore begins chapter 3. Therefore, holy brethren, so now we've seen he had to be made like us in all things. Therefore, he became a faithful and merciful high priest to give help to us. So therefore, we are to look at him in comparison to Moses. You say, well, Moses wasn't the high priest. Actually, Moses was the high priest before there was a high priest. What was the role of the high priest? What was his base role in relationship with the people and with God? He was a mediator. He was the go-between. This is how God spoke to the people. This is how the people spoke to God. So before Aaron was appointed a high priest under the law, who was their high priest? His younger brother Moses. Absolutely. Moses was the spokesperson. Remember that one time where Aaron and Miriam said, "Who appointed you as the only spokesperson?" God said, "I did." There's another time where the people rebelled. "Well, who made you the rule over us? We need to elect a new leader." God opened it up and said, "I did." Moses was their leader, unquestioned. He was their leader. He was their high priest. Even after Aaron was appointed as a high priest, did Moses no longer talk with God? Was Moses no longer a mediator or intercessor for the people? Not at all. In fact, David did that whole series of lessons from Exodus 33, 32, 33, and 34. We'll talk about it again in a minute. Moses still had face-to-face contact with God. Moses was still the spokesman for God and the mediator for the people. How many times did he save the existence of the people of Israel personally because of his intervention on their behalf? That's a merciful and faithful high priest. And now the writer of Hebrews says, yes, he was. He was faithful over his house. He was given the house. What can we say about the Son? What about his house? He built it. He even said that himself, "I will build my church." Moses had a house that was built by someone else, God, and given to him, and he was a faithful manager over that house. The Son built his house. Built it on the foundation that he was the Son of the living God. And so he is more faithful, more merciful, more trustworthy. Notice this is not putting Moses down at all. This is elevating the Son even higher. So again, this is to give them confidence. It's to say, contrast. Look at this. You've seen Moses. What did the people of Israel think about Moses while he was alive? How many times do we read, "Let's appoint for ourselves a new leader and kill this Moses, this Aaron"? But what did they think about him in the first century? How do first century Jews think of Moses? Yeah, he's the highest there is. Anybody speaks against Moses, we're going to kill them. This Paul, he's speaking about doing away with the law, doing away with the temple. Let's kill Paul. Jesus wants to destroy this temple in 3 days. We're going to kill him. Nobody speaks against Moses. Writer of Hebrews is not speaking against Moses. In fact, Jesus and Paul didn't either. But what he is saying is Jesus is higher. Jesus is better. Jesus has been made perfect. That's the key that we need to see from what he's getting at here. You had good, God is giving better. He's worthy of more glory. How much glory did Moses have? We go back to Exodus 33. How much glory did Moses have? His face was so bright, had to cover it with a veil. People couldn't even look at him. And how much of that glory came from Moses himself? Not one bit. That was all reflected glory from being in the presence of God. How much glory does Jesus have? What do you see when you look at Jesus? people of Israel saw a face that shone so bright they couldn't look at it. What do you see when you look at Jesus in your own mind? That's a challenge, isn't it? Do I see so much glory that it washes out everything else in my life? How much of that glory comes from Jesus himself? Ben?
Something like you're talking about that made me think a little bit about Logan too. So effectively, I bought so recently his Bible, and it arranges it from Genesis to John because they think chronologically that's the order it's written, right? What's cool about when they arrange it that way is you really see this comparison of light and God's glory as the light beginning and ending creation.
Okay.
And so you talk about this right now. It's just, to me, it's really impressing. A practical application of it is, we know God created the light for the sun, so this light is something greater than that. You talk about Moses' face and the glory of God and how bright it was. To me, that's just a reflection of, in John, it tells us that the light was the light in man. And he tells us that in chapter 1. And so for me, that's just such a really, tangible way to employ that. It's like, when I'm called the light of the world, I'm showing God's glory.
Yes.
It was literally so bright in Moses that people couldn't look at him, but how bright can I possibly make my glory of God shine in my life,
Great illustration. And I love your going back to the creation, because that's a great illustration. There's so much that God does that has connections with ideas and thoughts that he will talk about later. And that's a really good one. Light was the very first thing created. And the distinction between light and darkness is the second thing that we see. And then we see later the gathering of the lights. And you have the bright light of the day, and then you have the moon and the stars, which are lesser lights. Where does the moon get its light? It's reflected light from the sun. It doesn't have any light of its own. It's a reflected light. But what about the sun itself? It generates its own light. And that's a really good illustration. Moses was a reflected light. Jesus is a generated light. And just as the sun is vastly brighter than the moon, that's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to understand about the glory. The glory of Moses, the glory of the sun. Thank you so much for that illustration. All right, let me look at just a couple more verses here in chapter 3. I wanted to try to get down through verse 6. Look at what he says here in verse 5. Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant. Moses came to serve the people of Israel. We see that attitude in what he did. He was very much a servant, and God calls him faithful as a servant. You may be thinking, well, I remember Jesus said the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And absolutely, his attitude was to serve. Well, what does the writer of Hebrews say? Verse 6, but Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence, the boast of our hope firm until the end. Jesus came as a king. I've set my king on Zion. Now, he's a king who serves, but he still is a king. Moses was never a king, never wanted to be a king. Well, let me take that back. After he was humbled for 40 years, he never wanted to be a king. Moses served, Jesus reigns. And so what does that mean for us? How much more confidence do we have? Looking at Jesus as the builder and the maintainer of our house, the merciful and faithful high priest who reigns over us and serves us. I know how I feel. I feel good about Jesus. I feel good about being one of his disciples. I feel good about being in his house. Anybody with any thoughts or comments? All right, I'm going to ask you next week not only to read the remainder of chapter 3, also read Psalm 95. It's only 11 verses, not a long psalm. Please read Psalm 95 because it is very central to what we're going to be talking about next week in our class. Thank you so much.